Welcome to Dreamy Old Stories. Here we tell slow and gentle tales from history. Stories that calm your mind and help you fall asleep. If you enjoy the journey, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, let's begin tonight's dreamy story. Tonight's story begins in a quiet corner of history, a place that is rarely visited in a rush. There is no battlefield here, no great speech echoing through stone halls, no sudden turn of fate. There is only a table near a window, a piece of papyrus resting on the wood, and in a steady human hand, a slender reed pen waiting to touch the page. The moment is unremarkable. That, of course, is exactly why it matters. The room feels settled now. Not settled in the sense of finished, but settled in the way habits settle into place and stop feeling new. The quill belongs here without question. The reed still belongs to, but in a quieter manner. The way old furniture belongs in a house even after the room has been rearranged by this time. In much of Europe, the quill is no longer introduced with explanation. It does not need justification. It simply is. New scribes are trained with it from the beginning. Their early mistakes are shaped by the slight flexibility of feather rather than the firm resistance of reed. Their fingers learn a lighter pressure. Their hands grow used to a tool that bends rather than pushes back. They will not miss what they never learned. For them, the reed is something they encounter later, if they encounter it at all. It appears in old manuscripts, in marginal notes written generations earlier, in the careful descriptions of teachers who speak of older methods with calm neutrality. It has already begun to drift into the past in their imagination, yet the reed is still very much alive elsewhere, in the quiet discipline of Islamic calligraphy. The reed remains central, unchanged in its role and meaning. Here, the quill does not represent progress. It represents an alternative, useful in practical writing but unsuitable for sacred proportion. The reed continues to be cut according to strict rules. The angles remain precise. The grip remains controlled. The student still learns patience through resistance, whole. Lifetimes pass under the guidance of reed pens, without a single quill ever challenging their place. This parallel existence of tools stretches on for centuries. The writing world does not converge into one single path. It divides, overlaps, and circles back on itself in slow patterns in European academic life. The quill now dominates classrooms and universities. Students copy lectures. They annotate margins. They write theses and letters of recommendation. The sound in these rooms is softer now, less scratching, more flowing movement. Over time, even the sound of writing changes, though nearly no one notices. The reed once gave the room a dry, steady rasp. The quill answers with a gentler whisper. The difference is subtle. Still, it shapes the atmosphere in this quieter sound. Knowledge continues to move. Printing has not yet arrived in full force. Every book still passes through patient hands. The quill moves across the page in long, gently curved motions. Scribes begin to develop personal rhythms shaped by the tool. Some write in long, confident arcs. Others in careful, restrained strokes. The quill allows greater variation in individual style than the reed ever did. This individuality slowly becomes visible in handwriting. The reed once encouraged uniformity through resistance. The quill now invites variation through flexibility. The tool shapes expression not only in letters but in identity. Meanwhile, the reed's role in Europe shrinks further toward the edges. It appears in early handwriting training in conservative schools. It appears in rural offices where supplies still lag behind central markets. It appears in moments of necessity when quills run out. It appears when someone remembers how to cut one. More often, it does not. This quiet fading is not violent. It is not a rejection. It is simply an outcome of comfort, supply, and habit aligning over time in craft guilds that support writing trades. Quill preparation becomes standard instruction. Young apprentices learn how to cure feathers, how to strip and harden them, how to cut tips that last. The craft itself develops refinements that the reed never needed. Specialized knives, sharpening stones, storage methods that preserve spring and shape. The reed remains simple, and simplicity, while dependable, does not always compete well with refinement when systems grow larger. Writing offices expand. Bureaucracy thickens. Courts require multiple copies of the same document. Clerks work longer hours. Tools that endure longer without reshaping are favored without debate. No dislike of the reed is required for preference to shift. Preference often shifts without anyone feeling it move. In personal households, however, the story remains mixed. A family that writes only occasionally may still use a reed because it is easy. It requires no merchant, no special preparation. It belongs to the land. In this way, the reed continues to anchor writing to the natural world in certain quiet corners. Wherever people live close to water, reeds still grow. A child may cut one out of curiosity. An elder may show how to shape it. A few words may be written simply because the tool is there. These small acts do not appear in histories. They happen anyway. Over time, though, the symbolic image of writing changes. The quill begins to dominate visual culture. Paintings of scholars show feathers poised dramatically above pages. Emblems of learning adopt the curved plume as shorthand for knowledge, wisdom, authorship. The reed disappears from these images almost entirely. This symbolic shift matters more than it appears. When a tool disappears from imagery, it starts to disappear from memory, even if it still exists in practice. Future generations inherit symbols more than they inherit techniques. The quill's image grows. The reed's image fades, yet even as memory thins in one place, it deepens in another. In traditional calligraphy circles, the reed becomes not just a pen, but a lineage. A student learns not simply how to write, but how to cut reeds according to a teacher's method. The way a master shapes a nib becomes part of that master's signature. The reed holds identity in its angle and proportions. Here, the reed does not dissolve into obscurity. It becomes more itself. This contrast creates a strange balance. In much of Europe, the reed becomes increasingly rare and unremarkable. In other traditions, it becomes increasingly revered. The same simple plant, split and shaped, carries diminishing weight in one world and deepening weight in another. Time allows these contradictions to exist without trouble. The quill now shapes nearly all official European writing. Laws are penned. Borders are defined. Inheritance is recorded. Schools use it. Churches use it. Guilds use it. The act of writing itself grows more dense. More people learn to read and write. More people leave marks behind them. The reed once carried the early burden of this growth. Now the quill carries its continuation. The transition, seen from a distance, appears smooth. Seen from within, it feels invisible. No one wakes up one morning and thinks, "The age of the reed has ended." They wake up thinking about what must be written today. In that quiet practicality, the reed's central role dissolves without ceremony. Yet the reed still waits in museum collections centuries later. Historians will hold ancient reed pens between their fingers and imagine the hands that once gripped them. They will note the wear on the tips. They will measure the angles. They will write papers about the evolution of writing instruments. They will place the reed into timelines and diagrams. The people who used these pens never imagined such afterlives for them. The reed was simply accurate or dull, sharp or split, useful or not useful. Nothing more. The writing desk feels different than it did at the beginning of our story. The balance has shifted more decisively. The quill is not just common, it is assumed. The reed is no longer beside it in equal presence. It has moved further into the background still. It has not vanished. It waits in tradition. It waits in quiet regions. It waits in memory. It waits along the water's edge, where it always grew long before it ever became a tool. When we return, we will continue into a period where the reed, now largely displaced from everyday European writing, begins to live most visibly through preservation, revival, and historical awareness rather than daily necessity. For now, the quill carries the present. The reed carries the past, and both, in their own ways, continue to shape the human urge to leave a mark behind. The reed now lives mostly in quieter spaces, not vanished, not extinguished, not even entirely forgotten, just quieter. The great desks of administration belong almost entirely to the quill now. The long tables of royal offices, the crowded rooms of legal clerks, the growing universities, the expanding libraries. In these places, the feather has become as ordinary as wood and stone. It is no longer admired. It is simply expected to be there. Expectation settles deeply. Once it does, it rarely notices what came before it. The reed, meanwhile, continues to exist in places where expectation does not travel as quickly. These are not dramatic places. They are modest rooms with uneven floors, small schools at the edge of towns, houses where someone keeps a few tools out of habit rather than necessity. These spaces do not announce themselves to history. They simply hold it quietly. In a rural school, a teacher opens a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside are reeds cut months ago. Some have warped slightly. Some have split and will be discarded. A few remain usable. The teacher selects one and trims it slowly. The students watch with the vague impatience of youth. They want to begin writing. They do not care which tool touches the page. For them, this is not about tradition. It is about the day's lesson. The reed scratches. The students write their letters. Ink stains their fingers. A few complain. Most adapt. They always do. Elsewhere, far from this small room, a university lecture hall fills with students holding quills. Their desks are worn smooth by generations of similar hands. Their inkwells are fixed in place. The quill moves easily across the page. Their writing is faster, rounder, more fluid. They complain about nothing except the lecture itself. Two worlds exist at the same time. Neither considers the other outdated. They simply do not think about one another at all. This quiet separation allows the reed to continue breathing in narrow spaces long after its larger role has faded. It is not preserved deliberately. It simply survives by being useful where it remains useful, in the realm of art. However, the reed begins to experience a subtle return, not through necessity, but through attention. Artists and scholars, looking backward, notice differences in older lines. They see the firmness, the texture, the certain stiffness in ancient manuscripts that the quill does not naturally produce. Curiosity stirs. A few begin to experiment, not to restore the old tool to dominance, but to understand it. They cut reeds. They test ink. They compare strokes. They learn that some of what they once attributed to stylistic choice was, in fact, shaped quietly by the tool itself. This discovery does not change everyday habits. It does nothing to challenge the quill, but it gives the reed a new kind of presence, no longer central, no longer practical. Now, it becomes something studied. Study is a different form of life. In calligraphy traditions, where the reed never lost its place, this distinction feels unnecessary. There, the reed requires no revival. It never vanished to begin with. It is cut and used today just as it was centuries ago. The continuity feels natural rather than historical. Students in those traditions do not feel that they are preserving the past. They feel that they are inhabiting the present correctly. Elsewhere, however, the reed now feels old in a way the quill does not. Not broken, old. Historical, old. The difference is subtle but powerful. One tool belongs to common memory. The other begins to belong to museums, books, and controlled practice. Museums emerge slowly. Collections grow slowly. Someone places an old writing kit behind glass. A reed pen lies beside an ancient knife and a dried ink pellet. A small label describes its use. Visitors walk past it quietly. Few linger. Fewer still imagine how many ordinary pages that simple reed once shaped. Glass changes meaning. When the reed lay on a desk, it was unnoticed because it was useful. When it lies behind glass, it is unnoticed because it is distant. The form changes. The attention remains low. In literature, references to reed pens grow less frequent. Writers now describe quills when they describe writing. In symbolic language, the feather becomes the sign of authorship, scholarship, and thought. The reed disappears from metaphor. Symbols determine what is remembered more than objects do. Yet, even as the reed fades from metaphor in one part of the world, it remains alive in speech elsewhere. In many cultures, words for pens still trace their roots to reed-based instruments. The shape of language preserves what the desk no longer displays. Language remembers patiently. The reed now occupies several overlapping identities at once. In some places, it is a daily tool. In others, it is an artistic instrument. In others still, it is an artifact. These identities do not cancel each other out. They simply coexist across different distances. What unites them is quietness. The reed is not dramatic in any of its forms. Even as an artifact, it does not demand attention. Even as a sacred tool, it encourages control rather than flourish. Even as a child's pen, it teaches patience rather than speed. Patience follows, it like a shadow. The people who once depended on the reed in government offices are now long gone. The clerks whose wrists once ached from its stiff resistance have been replaced by generations shaped by the quill's softer balance. Their habits pass forward without memory of what came before. The transition has fully taken root, yet earlier manuscripts still sit in archives. Pages written by reed and quill rest beside one another. To the untrained eye, they look the same. To the trained eye, they tell separate mechanical stories. To the reed itself, if it could think in such terms, this difference would mean nothing at all. It served. It stopped serving. It continued quietly where it could. That is all, in private diaries, in obscure town ledgers, in forgotten school exercises. The reed's work still rests folded between pages that few will ever open again. These documents do not sit behind glass. They sit in boxes, in attics, in chests, slowly aging in darkness. The reed sleeps inside them. The quill writes the present. The reed writes the unseen past. Even the sound of writing, once shaped by the reed, has faded in memory. Fewer people remember the firmer rasp it produced. The quill's softer whisper becomes the dominant remembered sound of literacy. This too changes how later generations imagine earlier ones. They imagine smoother movements. They imagine fewer pauses. They imagine a rhythm closer to their own. The reed once shaped a slightly different rhythm. It enforced interruption. It invited reconsideration. It made the hand stop more often, if only for a moment, to reshape the tip, to lose a line of thought and then find it again. That rhythm is now largely lost in European writing, carried forward only in certain traditions and restorations. Lost rhythms are not mourned when no one hears them. Fade as centuries continue to move forward. New tools appear further down the line. Metal nibs, mechanized pens, printing presses. The quill itself will eventually begin to feel old in its turn. When that happens, it will begin its own slow drift toward tradition and artifact, much as the reed did before it. The reed becomes the first chapter in a long pattern. A tool rises. A tool settles. A tool recedes. Another rises in its place. None of them disappear absolutely. They change posture within the story, by now, in the broader European imagination. The reed exists mostly as an idea rather than a habit. Scholars mention it. Artists rediscover it. Curators preserve it. But daily hands rarely shape their writing with it. The quill's reign feels complete, and yet, elsewhere, the reed continues its daily work with no awareness of its altered status. This is one of history's quiet contradictions. A thing may fade in one world while remaining unchanged in another. The reed, standing rooted in water, does not know which world it belongs to. The desk before us now looks unmistakably of the quill's age. The feather dominates. The knife that shapes it grows dull and sharp again many times over. The reed, if present, is incidental rather than obvious. But it is still present. It always seems to find a way to remain. Waiting has become its permanent posture in many places. Waiting in drawers. Waiting in collections. Waiting in traditions. Waiting beside rivers where no one yet knows what future hand might choose to shape it again. When we return, we will move further into this era of memory and revival, where the reed is no longer part of everyday expectation in most places, but becomes a subject of intentional return, quiet admiration, and careful restoration for now. The quill moves steadily across the page. The reed rests, and the long, slow story of writing continues without pause. The reed has become something people return to on purpose now, not because they must, not because it is everywhere, but because it is no longer everywhere. This changes the nature of its touch. In places where the quill has ruled for generations, the reed now appears as a choice made with awareness. An artist selects it for a specific line. A historian uses it to understand how older hands once moved. A calligrapher studies it as an object of technique rather than habit. Each of these returns is quiet and deliberate. None of them are rushed. The reed responds well to unhurried attention. It always has. By now, the quill's dominance feels stable enough that few bother to defend it. It has become background, the symbol of writing itself. The feather appears in seals, in university emblems, in painted portraits of poets and scholars long after the people themselves are gone. The quill no longer feels like a tool. It feels like an idea. The reed, in contrast, takes on the opposite quality. It becomes more concrete, more physical. It is felt again as something cut from the world rather than fashioned through trade alone. Those who handle it now are often struck by its simplicity, its fragility, the way it gives and breaks differently. From metal or feather, handling the reed in this later age feels almost intimate. A person who cuts one for the first time after growing up entirely with quills may be surprised by how easily it splits if handled carelessly. The material does not forgive impatience. The angle must be right. The knife must be steady. Each cut leaves a permanent mark. There is no undoing. This alone teaches a kind of restraint that later tools do not demand as strongly. These small lessons are noticed by those who choose to learn them. They are unnoticed by the wider world. In schools devoted to classical learning, especially in the centuries that follow, occasional teachers begin to reintroduce the reed as a way of connecting students physically with earlier methods. This is not widespread. It is not systematic. It is quiet and scattered. A student may encounter it once and never again. Another may develop a lifelong fascination. In either case, the reed's presence now feels different from what it once was. It is no longer a default. It is an invitation. Museums and private collections slowly grow more aware of the value of everyday tools. Not the golden objects of kings, but the humble instruments that once supported entire systems. Among these, reed pens begin to appear more frequently. Some are well preserved. Some are barely recognizable. The hollow stems have collapsed with time. The tips have softened into vague shapes. Curators label them carefully. Visitors glance at them quickly. Most do not linger. The reed is not dramatic. It does not glitter. It does not shout. It does not need to. In academic study, awareness of the reed deepens. Paleographers examine strokes and pressure. They reconstruct ancient writing habits by studying wear patterns left on parchment. They simulate the motion of early hands using newly cut reeds. Through this, they discover details no text ever states outright. How often the pen was lifted, how much pressure was applied, how a scribe might have adjusted his grip mid-word. These studies do not change the past. They reveal it in quieter detail. Through such work, the reed returns not as a tool of daily function, but as a key to understanding. Understanding is another form of use. In parts of the world where the reed never fully left daily practice, this scholarly return may seem strange. There, the reed never fell asleep in memory. It stayed awake in hands. The art never needed revival because it never faded enough to require it. This contrast continues quietly without resolution. The reed now exists in layers. In some places, it is present but peripheral. In some places, it is present and central. In others, it is present only in thought. These layers overlap like echoes rather than lines. Meanwhile, The quill moves toward its own moment of transition. Printing presses multiply. Books become more common. Metal nibs begin to appear. Mechanization edges closer to writing itself. The quill, once the quiet successor to the reed, now begins to experience the faint pressure of being succeeded in turn. This does not happen suddenly. No one stands up and announces the end of the quill age, but new tools appear beside it. At first, they seem then practical, then ordinary. Eventually, they become expected in certain settings. The pattern repeats itself, almost without variation. The reed watches from far behind in the line of succession. By this point in the long chain of change, the reed has already accepted its changed position. It no longer competes. It no longer tries to keep pace. It simply continues where it is invited, in personal rituals of writing. Some individuals begin to choose reed pens for reasons that have little to do with efficiency. They speak of feeling closer to the material, of feeling the resistance of the past, of slowing their own thoughts to match the slower tool. These are private reasons. They do not form movements. They remain personal. This new relationship to the reed carries a faint sense of reverence that it never needed when it was simply common. Once, it was used because it was there now. It is used because it means something. Meaning grows most easily in absence, in literature. Historical novels and scholarly works begin to mention the reed again, now as a marker of age rather than of normality. Writers use it to signal antiquity, to set a scene far from their reader's present. The reed becomes a quiet shorthand for long-ago worlds. The very thing that once made it invisible now makes it symbolic. Symbols drift differently than tools. The reed's symbolic life becomes more visible than its practical one in many places. Yet the object itself still waits beside rivers, unchanged. Reeds continue to grow because water and light continue to meet. The plant does not participate in symbolism. It participates in weather. Someone passing by a river may still break one from the bank, feeling its smooth surface between the fingers. They may not even know that this simple plant once carried the weight of entire bureaucracies. They may throw it back into the water without thought. This too is part of the reed's story. It is never asked for. Remembrance in quiet workshops dedicated to historical reconstruction. The reed regains a small but steady presence. Craftsmen cut them by hand. They test inks. They write copies of ancient texts using the same tools as their sources. Through this work, they encounter problems their predecessors faced. Splitting tips, inconsistent flow, the need for constant attention. These inconveniences, once ordinary, now feel novel. From novelty comes appreciation. From appreciation comes careful use. The reed becomes a teacher again. But now its students come looking for it instead of encountering it by necessity. In spiritual writing traditions that never left the reed behind, this outside revival feels distant. They do not experience the reed as a rediscovered object. They experience it as continuity. For them, nothing has been lost, nothing recovered. The hand still cuts the reed. The ink still flows. The proportions still guide the stroke. The chain remains unbroken. This coexistence of broken and unbroken chains forms a gentle paradox in the reed's story. For some, it is memory. For others, it is the present. For others still, it is a rediscovery. None of these cancel the others. The reed does not demand to be one thing only, as the centuries continue their patient unfolding. The quill's dominance also begins to thin in certain spaces. New writing technologies arrive. The sound of writing changes again. New rhythms replace old ones. The quill, once the quiet successor, begins its own slow drift toward background and symbolism. The reed now watches this from a distance it once did not have, it does not gain pride from. These tools do not carry such awareness, but the humans who study this long chain begin to notice the repeating pattern. They begin to see that no tool truly vanishes. It only steps aside differently. It becomes less common, then less practical, then more symbolic. Then it becomes memory. Then sometimes it becomes practice again in narrow circles. The reed has already traveled this entire arc at this stage in our story. The reed has settled comfortably into its layered existence. It is no longer confused about where it stands. It stands in several places at once, in the hands of calligraphers who learned from living teachers, in the drawers of collectors who value it as an object, in the exercises of curious students who meet it briefly in the riverbeds where it still grows. Indifferent to all of this, the writing desk of the wider world now belongs to newer tools. The quill itself is no longer eternal, and so, quietly, the reed's role shifts from participant in the present to witness of the past and teacher for the future. Witnesses do not speak loudly, they endure. The image before us is no longer a single desk with competing tools. It is many desks across many centuries, each with its own expectations. On some, the reed dominates. On others, it rests in memory alone. On still others, it lies somewhere in between, chosen with care rather than by habit. The quill, once the quiet newcomer, now fills the role the reed once filled. It, too, will one day slip into layered existence. But that story belongs further ahead. For now, the reed remains what it has become. No longer the center of writing. No longer absent either. It is presence without dominance. It is memory with a pulse when we return. We will move toward the later stages of this long transformation, where the reed story becomes fully historical in most parts of the world, and where its meaning settles into quiet permanence rather than daily motion. For now, the river still carries its slow light across the banks. Reeds still bend in the useless wind. And somewhere far from here, a hand still cuts one carefully, simply because it always has. By now, the reed has fully entered the long, quiet phase of its story, not the phase of invention, not the phase of dominance, not even the phase of competition. This is the phase of after. The world of writing has moved on in visible ways. The quill, once the new presence at the desk, has itself begun to feel traditional. In many places, it still works without challenge. In others, newer tools have already begun to surround it. Metal nibs appear. Mechanical pens whisper into existence. Printing reshapes the meaning of handwriting altogether. The desk grows more complex. The act of writing grows more layered, and far behind all of this, the reed rests in its settled quietness. In most European lives now, the reed never appears at all. A person might live an entire lifetime filled with letters, signatures, school exercises, contracts, and personal notes without ever touching or seeing one. If the reed comes to mind, it is usually only as a distant detail from another age, an image in a book, a label in a museum. a brief mention in a lecture. It has become safely historical. This safety is strange. When something becomes safely historical, it no longer belongs to the pressure of daily necessity. It no longer carries urgency. It becomes something that can be observed without needing to be mastered. The reed once demanded mastery. Now it invites curiosity in archives. Its former labor lies folded into shelves that few hands visit. Account books written with reeds no longer regulate anything. Their numbers have expired. Their merchants are gone. Their transactions ended centuries ago. Yet the lines remain, patiently waiting for eyes that might never arrive. Religious manuscripts, copied by red hands, still recite the same words they always did. Their meaning has not changed, but the hands that once pressed those lines into place exist now only as imagined shapes behind the strokes dot to later readers. The reed becomes invisible again, not because it is common, because it is forgotten behind the text. This is a different kind of invisibility than before. In the past, the reed was invisible because it was too ordinary to notice. Now it is invisible because it is too far away. Distance produces its own form of silence. Historians, however, do not like silence very much. They listen closely for what has been muted. They piece together fragments. They compare textures. They examine edges. Through them, the reed gains a faint voice again, but only in narrow rooms filled with measured debate. They speak of tip angles, of ink behavior, of pressure patterns in early scripts. They reconstruct motions and make careful claims. Their conclusions are cautious. Their language is restrained. They are aware that they study absence as much as presence. Through such work, the reed is not revived as a daily tool. It is revived as a subject. Subjects are treated gently. In some universities, students in paleography courses handle replicas of reed pens. They are taught to write a few lines using reconstructed methods. Their strokes wobble. The ink pools unexpectedly. The resistance surprises their hands. They smile a little. Then they return the replica and go back to their regular pens. The reed leaves a brief impression and recedes again. That is enough for now, in studios of calligraphy, where the reed never left. These academic encounters may feel strangely detached. There, the reed is not a lesson about the past. It is simply the tool of the present. Students do not smile at its oddity. They struggle with it daily. Their wrists tighten. Their discipline grows slowly. Their masters correct silently. The reed remains serious work. So the world now contains two kinds of reed. Users, those who turn to it briefly in order to understand what has. Ben, and those who never left it in the first place. Both contribute to its survival in different ways. What neither does is return it to dominance. That era has passed without regret. The systems built upon quills, presses, and newer tools are too vast to turn back. Even if every reed by every river were cut again tomorrow, they would not reshape writing into its old form, and the reed does not wish to reshape anything. Its story now is not about power. It is about persistence. Persistence does not mean constant motion. It means continued existence across changing ground. The reed has already adjusted its place many times, from dominance to coexistence, from coexistence to specialization, from specialization to symbol, from symbol to study, from study into renewal within narrow traditions. There is no single ending point, only posture by now. In many cultural narratives, The reed serves as a marker of deep time. Writers mention it when they want to place the reader in a distant age. They do not describe its function. They assume the function is already understood as old. Old is not the same as obsolete. Yet the reed is often spoken of as if it were. This does not trouble the river where it grows. The river continues to bend and straighten without instruction. Reeds continue to grow because water and earth continue to meet. That meeting does not require historians, artisans, or storytellers to approve it. The reed belongs as much to geography as it ever did to writing. This too is part of its endurance. The quill, once grown from birds, now faces its own layered future. It becomes first common, then traditional, then symbolic, then historical. The same pattern unrolls gently forward. The reed, watching from far behind in the sequence, has already completed that cycle. Few things in history are allowed to complete cycles without interruption. The reed is one of them. In quiet moments of personal writing, some modern individuals choose to return to tools that slow their hands. Some choose fountain pens. Some choose dip pens. A very few choose reeds. They seek a kind of friction that modern tools remove. They seek the reminder that thought once moved at a slower pace because motion itself was slower. They find that the reed demands attention in a way modern tools do not. They find that they must pause. They find that their letters grow more deliberate. They do not usually stay with it. Life is not built to accommodate such slowness for long. Still, for a while, the reed enters their days and asks them to match its rhythm. Then it leaves again. The reed has learned not to insist in museums. Laws of preservation surround it. Humidity controls, temperature regulation, protective mounts. It lies under light that fades gently every evening. It is watched by guards who mostly watch visitors rather than objects. At closing time, the lights dim. The reed returns to darkness, surrounded by quiet air. This is very different from the sunlight it once leaned into at the river's edge. Different, but not unmade. In religious settings where it remains central, the reed never enters glass. It remains alive within practice. Here, preservation does not mean stasis. It means continuity. Each generation cuts new reeds to replace the old. The lineage is carried in hands, rather than in cabinets. This is a rare way of preserving anything. Most things are preserved by being kept still. The reed, in these traditions, is preserved by being used elsewhere. Its preservation is conceptual. It lives in footnotes, reconstructions, glossaries. It becomes part of explanation rather than function. Students memorize that writing once used reeds before quills became standard. This information passes into educational structure. It becomes a fact rather than a memory. Facts feel tidy. Memory is less neat. The reed, now largely reduced to fact in many places, loses the emotional texture it once carried. No one now associates it with tired wrists at the end of a long day's copying. No one now associates it with ink-stained fingers from childhood lessons. These sensations existed once. They shaped lives. They are now absent. Absence is the final stage of everyday experience. Yet even in this absence, the reed has not become meaningless. It becomes weight in a different direction. It becomes a quiet representative of the vast amount of human labor that rarely enters grand narratives. It stands in for the countless quiet days of writing that kept societies functioning without spectacle. The reed never stood on a battlefield, never signed a treaty, it never lifted a crown, it stood beside those moments, it shaped the records that described them after the noise had passed. In this way, the reed's truest legacy is not found in moments of action, but in moments of accounting. In the steady work that follows every event once excitement fades, that work persists whether tools are noticed or not. In modern discussions of technology, people often look for moments of rupture, revolutions, disruptions, sudden change. The reed's story offers a gentler pattern, replacement that takes its time, decline that does not destroy, survival that does not announce itself. It suggests that most human change moves less like lightning and more like water. Water does not argue, it shifts shape until the land eventually responds. The reed has followed water all along. The reed now appears not as a competitor, not even as a participant in most of the modern world of writing, but as a continuous thread woven far underneath it, a thread that can still be touched, still be followed, still be understood by those who choose to bend down and look closely. It no longer sits on the main desk of history, it rests beneath the surface, but beneath the surface is still. Within the world, we will gently bring the story to its calm conclusion. We will look at what remains when usefulness has passed, when dominance has faded, and when memory itself grows quiet. For now, the river still moves. The reed still grows. The story still pauses patiently between one breath and the next. The reed has reached the part of its story where everything is quiet, not the quiet of abandonment, not the quiet of disappearance. A different kind, the quiet that comes after a long life of usefulness, when a tool no longer carries the weight of daily tasks, but still rests in the world with its own gentle dignity. By now, the reed lives mostly in small pockets of practice, in careful study, in memory, and in the natural places where it has always grown. The great desks of writing, once shaped by its presence, have moved on to quills, then to metal nibs, then to presses, then to machines that carry thought across wires rather than across pages. The world has expanded faster than the reed ever could, but expansion does not erase what grew slowly. The reed remains what it has always been, a modest, hollow plant that answers only to the river and the wind. It could never have predicted the centuries of writing it would support. It could not have imagined that hands would shape it into an instrument of record, prayer, law, poetry, and memory. It did not seek to be part of any of this. The reed simply stood where the water rose, year after year, until someone long ago noticed its straight form and quiet potential. Everything since then has been the slow unfolding of that simple discovery. In this final moment of our story, the reed sits not on a working desk, but in a space shaped by reflection. A museum, perhaps. A study room. A calligrapher's workshop where tradition still flows uninterrupted. Or maybe in a drawer where someone once kept it because it felt too interesting to throw away. Each of these places holds the reed differently in a museum. It rests under glass. The air around it is controlled. Light touches it gently. People pass by without stopping. A few pause out of curiosity, reading the small label that gives its age and origin. Then they move on. The reed does not mind the briefness of their attention. It is accustomed to being overlooked even in its most active days. In a scholar's study, the reed might be surrounded by replicas, ink samples, parchment fragments, and notes comparing stroke patterns. Here, it is not admired for appearance, but for information. It helps decode the motions of hands long gone. It helps fill small gaps in understanding. Its legacy becomes part of research, built patiently, word by word, in a calligrapher's workshop. The reed holds a place of discipline. It is still cut with care. Its tip is still shaped with mindful slowness. Ink still gathers at its edge. It still responds to subtle pressure. Students still learn the weight of quiet tradition through it. They do not use it to reenact the past. They use it because it remains alive in their present. These three versions of the reed coexist without conflict. One preserved, one studied, one practiced, all of them real. Meanwhile, along riverbanks and marshes across the world, reeds continue to grow with no awareness at all that they were ever part of human civilization's long writing history. They bend with the wind, they sway, they break and regrow. Their cycle knows nothing of kings, markets, monasteries, or manuscripts. The natural world continues its patterns independent of the tools humans once shaped from it. This separation between natural life and historical life is perhaps the reed's final lesson. The human story borrowed the reed for a while. Then it returned the reed to the world it came from. The reed did not change. We did dot the shift from reed to quill, did not mark a revolution. It marked a slow adjustment of hands and habits. The reed served well. Then the quill served better in certain tasks. The transition unfolded without conflict because the tools themselves carried no pride. They only responded to the needs and expectations of their users. And expectations, once settled, tend to stay settled until new habits quietly replace them. This long pattern rise, use, shift, settle is echoed again when the quill later gives way to metal nibs. And then when metal nibs give way to mechanical pens, and then when pens themselves yield space to keyboards and screens. Yet even with all these transformations, the same desire remains, to make marks that hold meaning beyond the moment of their creation. The reed was the vessel for that desire in many early civilizations. It shaped the first curves of letters that would later be reshaped 100 times. It carried stories before stories had stable homes. It allowed knowledge to travel across time without traveling across distance. It did this quietly, without any of the acclaim that later technologies receive. And because of this quietness, the reed's legacy feels more like breath than footprint now, as we look gently across the entirety of its story. The reed appears not as a symbol of loss or of progress, but as a reminder of how much of history depends on simple things: a hollow plant, a sharp knife, a hand that lifts and presses, ink that settles, light at a window, a page waiting for marks. All the grand libraries of the world grow from such modest origins, even though the reed no longer fills the desks of most writers. It still fills the foundations of written culture. Every script that evolved after it carries traces of its shaping influence. Every quill stroke that flowed more easily did so partly because the reed once taught scribes what resistance felt like. Every writing tradition today, whether mechanical or digital, stands on a long chain of tools each, one replacing the other slowly, leaving small echoes behind. The reed is one of the deepest echoes. Its story is not about triumph or failure. It is about persistence through change, about usefulness without recognition, about the strange beauty of tools that serve so well that people stop noticing them altogether. in the end. Perhaps this is the reed's quiet victory. It shaped centuries of human thought without ever asking to be remembered. And yet here we are, remembering it. Not loudly, not with celebration, but with the same soft attention that defined its entire working life, as this final part draws to stillness. Imagine the reed one last time, not as artifact, not as symbol, not as tool, but simply as itself. A single slender stem rising from water, light touching its surface, wind passing over it without haste, a shape unchanged by centuries of use. Nothing in its appearance reveals the history it once carried. Nothing in its silence asks to be seen, and yet, for those who take a moment to look, the reed remains a gentle witness to the long, slow work of human writing, reminder that even the quietest tools can shape entire worlds. The story rests here. The river continues on. The reed continues to grow, and the page, as always, waits patiently for whatever hand comes next.